So as we make our way to our seats, I just wanted to take the opportunity to welcome everyone here this morning. I admit I pressed snooze 1.5 times this morning, so I know as the winter sort of starts to set in, it is harder to get to these kind of events. So we're really appreciative that you could make the time this morning. My name's Justine LaRoche, for those who I haven't had the chance to say hello to yet. I'm one of the directors here at Spring Point and tend to lead a lot of our leadership and learning engagements, so I may have crossed paths with you already through that, but otherwise look forward to getting to know you in due course. So Spring Point, for those who may be also unfamiliar to our organisation and brand, we tend to play in the culture, leadership and capability spaces, particularly where we can bring those together to affect positive organisational change. So if you needed a little bit of a sort of headline in terms of what we're all about, that's it. And just before I finish sort of those introductions, I'll just get the Spring Point team. I know they're scattered throughout the room today, but just to quickly stand up and wave. We've got Chelsea down the front, there's Dylan in the corner, Nolene, Mel, Soraya, Michelle, Deanna right down the back. So if you do have someone, a Spring Pointian in your midst, please say hi in the groups that you're in. So in terms of this morning, I'll do a very quick introduction to our topic, but I'm not going to hold the show up. But this morning, we're really looking at how super brands are leveraging culture and leadership to shape the future, based on a study tour that two of our members, Dylan and Chris, will introduce you more formally to those in a moment, really based on the insights that they took from a recent trip to the States. And the spin that we'd like to put on that this morning is really to provide those insights through both a science and a practice lens. So that's the focus for this morning. In terms of talking points, so it's all very introduction central at the moment. This may be, hands up if this is a first talking point breakfast for you. Oh, great, we've got some new faces and old faces, which is always great to see. So these events happen roughly every 8 weeks. They're really an opportunity for us to connect with our network, to hopefully allow you to connect with people who also are really passionate and focused in this space. We try to mix up the format each time, so hopefully it doesn't get tired. And keeps it fresh, and we really try to share everything that we're learning and seeing across the really diverse organisations that we work across. So if it's your first one, we hope you enjoyed, and if it's not, welcome back. So, in terms of that welcome, it was a great segue to our slide that we have here. I just wanted to acknowledge all the local super brands that we've got in the room today. Lots of really diverse organisations represented here. I know a lot of you are doing amazing things in those organisations, so we just ask that you share as much of that as you can. You're going to have opportunities to chat and get to know one another within your learning circles, and we know that a lot of the value that comes out of today is actually what you can learn from one another, not just some of the insights that we would like to share with you. So please keep that in mind. So that's the who's who in the room. So what I'd like to do now is give you an opportunity just to have a quick hello to the people you found yourself, the groups you found yourself in this morning. And I want you to consider this in terms of, we're going to focus in very soon on the 2 key destinations that our study tour incorporated, both Silicon Valley in San Fran and Washington, DC to attend SIOP, which is the Society of Industrial and Organisational Psychology Conference. It gets about 6,000 attendees each year. So if they're the 2 destinations and they're the sort of insights that we're going to be, or the location of our insights, just pretend now that this is a bit of an Oprah moment, and if I could fly you to either one of those destinations to glean your own insights, I just want to share in your groups for 2 minutes max, which one would you go to and why, and just use this as a quick opportunity to say hi before we get started. So this is your Oprah moment. But in terms of my Oprah moment, who's voting for San Fran? Who am I sending to San Fran? Okay, and the rest, Washington, DC? Oh, it's a bit of, I think Silicon Valley may be one out there. But let's see what we can actually share and offer up from both destinations. And to do that, I'd like to invite onto the stage Dylan Flavel, our Managing Director of Springpoint, and he spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, so you can pick his brains about that. So welcome to the stage, Dylan. Thank you.
Cool, round of applause.
I know, that's nice, isn't it? and his wingman on this trip, Chris Morfez, a senior consultant in our team. Welcome, Chris. And I'll leave us in your capable hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. Is this my bang? Yep. Terrific. So yes, I did spend the best part of a week with those interesting companies there, and including some time at Stanford University. Just a little story to start with. I got over there and I was feeling pretty fresh and excited, and spent the first day at Stanford University at their Innovation Centre, and it's a great time. And then the second day at Amazon, and had a wonderful time, and I'll share a bit about that. And I was still travelling on excitement and enthusiasm, but the third night I was ready for Google the next day, and I went to bed at a pretty good time, and I think I woke up at about 1 a.m. in the morning, and I couldn't get to sleep, and I lay awake all night. Just the jet lag had kicked in, and so I must have nodded off just before about 6:30 a.m. and slept through my alarm and slept through my group of 40 execs that I was travelling with, heading out to Google. If anyone has been to San Francisco? Has anyone been to Google? I've got a couple. Okay, it's not close. It's not close to downtown San Fran. So I readied myself, and I jumped down, and I jumped in a cab, and I sort of headed out there, and I just said to the guy, take me to Google. So he takes me to Google, drops me off, and then I'm sort of standing there, and I'm like, what the fuck? Where? So then I sort of walked up to a guy. I said, mate, I need to go to Google. And he's just sort of looked around, and he's like, everywhere's Google. And so so it's sort of like standing on Flinders Street steps and saying, hey, a passerby, some guy going to work, going, hey, can you take me to Melbourne? And it's like the whole place is Google. So it's a suburb in and of itself, really. We're going to spend the next 40 or 45 minutes with you sharing some of our insights from that trip. As you can see, I spent a little bit of time with Stanford University. They essentially were at the Innovation Centre, and they consult to the tech companies in Silicon Valley. Then some time at Amazon, some time at Google, and some time at Salesforce. Chris, do you want to tell us a little bit about PSYOP and what that is? I know Justine introduced it very briefly, but do you want to just tell us about
right. So PSYOP, as Justine mentioned, is the Society of Industrial and Organisational Psychology in the States. So they have an annual conference. This year it was in Washington, D.C. There are 6,000 psychs there. Got one of them over here as well. Vaughan, it's great to have you here. We had a fun night out after a conference, but what happens at PSYOP stays at PSYOP. So
does it now?
It doesn't. So there are over 1,000 presentations, huge array of topics, sort of seminars, workshops, posters, stands. So the scale of this thing was just immense, and I think from memory, Dill, it was the biggest attended PSYOP ever.
Yeah. Terrific. So maybe just before we kick off, what was on our mind as we went over to PSYOP? Look, for me, going over there, that's our little... We got over there. What was on their mind going over to San Fran and then to PSYOP? For me, going to San Francisco, I was really interested. I mean, these organisations, Amazon, Google, Salesforce in particular, they are, probably the most pervasive and large organisations in the world at the moment, or amongst. And I was really interested in what was on their mind in terms of future world of work and what that means for the work that we do. So that was probably my key thought there. The other one, I'd been warned that it could be a bit of a tech fest, this particular thing I went on. I'm going with a bunch of clients who had strong technology backgrounds, and so I was really interested to see how much of it was going to be about the tech versus the enablement of organisations. And I'm certainly pleased to say that more than half of the content I end up being on, because of the group and the interest of the group, but also because of the focus of Amazon, Google and Salesforce, was on leadership and culture and how they're enabling organisations. Chris, what was on your mind? Actually, I had one more thing on my mind. The other thing on my mind, being in San Fran, was to go to Napa Valley and have a glass of wine. So that was another thing on my mind as well.
Very nice one, Dylan. So for me, I had a couple of things top of my mind as well. From a content perspective, I was just really keen to hear about the new and emerging trends across the areas of culture, capability, and leadership. From a professional perspective, I was really keen to hear how other professionals in our space were positioning the work that we do to make sure that we've continuously got a seat at the table and having a real impact in the work that we do. And just following in Dylan's footsteps there, from a personal perspective, I was just keen to see how long I could last on a mechanical bull. So, but I think that's the topic for the next talking point. Is that right, Dylan?
Well, nearly. This is a surprise to Chris. So that was.
This is a stitch up, is what it is.
That was at second number 1 on the mechanical bull, and this was at second number 40, if you can see that. He was sort of a bit horizontal. And I did get to Napa Valley, and I did go and inspect the plantation there. So we managed to cover off some personal goals as well. So, without more further ado, what's a summary of our next little while is really why and how organisations are rewiring to prepare for the future world of work. And as Justine shared, we're going to take a science and a practitioner's perspective. How do the two come together? So we're going to break up the next 40 minutes into 2 bits. The first bit is about what is happening. So what is changing, the future world of work, and what are on the mind of organisations? How are they thinking about current and the next 5 to 10 and beyond years? So we're going to share the 5 key themes that I found when I went around and visited these organisations. What were the things that they were talking about as the pervasive themes? And then we're going to get into the so what. So what were our big takeouts from a practice and science perspective? So start with context and then get into some content. You've got a handout in front of you, and I encourage you to grab that and have a look at it as we go through, because I'm going to cover these first 5 key themes really, really quickly. We could probably spend hours in here and hours discussing and exploring each of these topics because they're big in and of themselves. And I had a little dry run through of today with my team on Friday, and they're like, "Whoa, there's so much to cover." So in some ways, today is about going, how do we give you some highlights, and we're always obviously open to talk about those more, and that'll be an opportunity you'll have after today, after our core session as well. So a little disclaimer before I go too far, and that is, I've put Amazon and Google up there. You could put Salesforce there, but obviously these organisations are pervasive in their influence beyond just their own organisation, and they're incredibly successful by most measures. However, I'm sort of quite aware, and I took a healthy dose of cynicism with me as well, that it doesn't mean that everything they do is amazing. And so in many ways, I was sort of there to reflect on what they are doing and what that might mean for us, but also what practices do I think they're executing that look like they're really working and can be played out more broadly. But I think there's always the need to bring that level of reflection to those types of things. And I guess that's in part why today we sort of are going to think about it from a science and practice perspective. So, what are the 5 themes that are shaping the future of work that I picked up on this particular trip? The first one won't be a particular surprise to many of you, and that is that CX or customer experience is king. It was the most pervasive part of the conversations that happened through the 5 days essentially that I was in and out of boardrooms and walking on particular organisations. I think I spent about 30 hours with across 14 particular execs and people embedded within those organisations, and this was the thing that came up most. If you look at the numbers, they tell the same story as well when we think about customer experience from a more from a data perspective. 86% of buyers will pay more for better customer experience. And by 2020, customer experience will overtake price and product as the key brand differentiator. That was really front and center. Up on that top right-hand side is Amazon's mission. We want to be the Earth's most customer-centric company, and it absolutely was front of mind of all the conversations that they were talking about. And the second one down there is Google's mission as well. Their mission is to organise the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Obviously, they don't talk about customer in there. It's quite implicit within that. However, of course, it's also implicit that they're doing things to strengthen their own company, and they do talk almost quite overtly about doing things that strengthen their brand and their work and build on their data, but also they must be useful to customers and they must be useful to everyday people every day. So they talk about that a lot. One of the key reasons pushing this is that they're sort of talking about the fact that there's massive product convergence. So products are becoming similar. The only way for us to continue to differentiate and drive value is through customer experience. So that was my first big theme. Second big theme was a really interesting one, and it's this concept of hyper-specialisation. So I attended a really amazing session by this lady, Lindsay Irvine, who's the COO of MuleSoft, who are a part of Salesforce. And she presented this amazing slide. I know you won't be able to see the detail of it, but essentially it's looking at hundreds, maybe not quite thousands, but hundreds of companies and the specialisation that's happening within companies these days. And essentially, Lindsay's narrative is that technology costs are going down. There are more market entrants than ever before, and because of the sort of digital ecosystem that we operate in, organisations have the opportunity to identify specific problems and develop specific solutions and companies around those specific problems, because they can access customers all around the world. So the resulting outcome of that has been companies that have focused on very particular problems, rather than being broad companies who would do a bit of everything in an average type of way. So it was a really fascinating session, and that was one of Lindsay's quotes up there, which is almost an outtake of that particular theme. She's saying, well, if we've got this massive hyper-specialisation happening, we need to be doing some things a bit differently, or thinking about the way we compete differently. And she was saying, you need to know what you're great at and knit that together with others to provide composite experiences. So she's talking about the need to join up, not just externally as organisations, thinking about who your partner organisations might be, but also internally. She's talking about connection, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on around the ability for not just hyper-specialisation, but hyper-connectivity. This next theme, so willingness to self-disrupt, this was a major focus in the day that I spent at Stanford University. As I said, they have a particular part of their university who are focused just on consulting to the large tech organisations within Silicon Valley, and really also looking at the trends that are happening within those organisations themselves. So if you think of them being at the very front of the crest of the future world of work, they're looking at them and going, what are they doing and what's happening within that group? And essentially the big theme they're talking about is that these organisations are increasingly willing to self-disrupt. And when we talk about self-disrupt, we're not talking about continuous improvement. We're talking about them being willing to cannibalise their own products and services to invest in the future, and to do that before time. So that's the really tricky part, is before they need to do that, they're identifying what needs to happen next and developing the future, which is at the cost of their business currently. So it's a really interesting thing, and there's some really interesting dynamics that play out around the organisations that can and can't do that, particularly listed and sort of non-listed companies. They talked about the challenge for listed companies to do that, where perhaps board members and executives aren't really incentivised to self-disrupt. So we talked a lot about that and the potential cost of self-disruption. They talked about many reasons, why is this happening, partly about the speed of change. They also talked about loyalty, customer loyalty, certainly being eroded or at least changing in its shape, and saying that customers are quite willing to shift from brands to challenger brands really quickly. And you'll probably know yourself, whatever a particular app you're using, service you're using, if you know that something better is out there, the ability to move and shift certainly is there, and the willingness of consumers to shift is high. A couple of examples of that. One that you'll probably be familiar with, that's a really interesting quote. I think that really captures this idea. If we don't create the things that will kill our company, someone else will, and that was really the core sentiment of this day, which doesn't suggest it's easy, but it's something that we need to be thinking about. A couple of big examples of self-disruption. One perhaps well-known one is Apple and the iPod and shifting to smartphone, and perhaps even a better example is the case study of Netflix and Blockbuster. Most of us know Netflix now as a digital organisation. Well, they weren't when they started. When they started, they were really in hardware. They were delivering videos to the door of people rather than people having to go and hire them out and go and get them and then take them back. They were delivering them physically. And one night they announced to the market and said, we're not in that business anymore. We're a tech company now. We're going to be a digital company. And this slide, you perhaps can see it, perhaps you can't. The one on the right really describes what happened after that. Was that Blockbuster went from being a sort of a $2 billion company, and within 6 months being bankrupt, and Netflix, as you sort of know, have continued to shift in a positive way. So on the left-hand side, this sort of describes the fact that the lifespan of large companies is decreasing. So this sort of massive failure of organisations, as in particular ones, is a real thing, and it's happening. So it's just building the case for actually we can't continue to go on the same trajectory. Okay, number 4 is this idea of big data and AI and machine learning. It's something that I think we've been talking about for years. Some of you will be experiencing this maybe very directly in your roles, may be involved in the implications of that. Some may not. My big takeout here is it's not coming, it's here. And so the time, particularly with Google, and also at SIOP, when you go there to look at all the vendors and look at some of the work that they're doing around the products, even in the people and HR space, they're doing amazing work, whether it's around data, around voice, whether it's around pattern recognition, whether it's around just taking big sets of data to make decisions. It's happening. So I guess broadly what we're talking about when we talk about AI and big data, and there'll be people in here who are as well or better versed to talk about this than me, is that we've now got the ability to access massive amounts of data, particularly through joined up systems, and to interrogate that data to look for patterns and to support prediction and decision making. And essentially it's helping us to make what were really costly activities in organisations, in the workplace, decrease the cost of those massively, increase the quality and effectiveness of those through sort of a level of predictive decision making in its various forms, because it can play out in so many different ways. And they showed so many different technologies that Google has that can support this, whether it's around marketing, whether it's around management of documents in organisations who are still using some quite old ways of thinking about that. So it was just a proliferation of things, and part of the key insight that this fella here, Paddy Collins, who spoke to us from Google, is he's saying the biggest challenge is now not to be bounded in your thinking about amazing solutions, because he's essentially saying the tech can do it. You just need to be able to think about the problems that your customers have and the challenges that you have internally, and then find a way to hack that, because he's saying the technology is amazing. So that was probably a really big insight for me, was just that it's not coming. It's here and it's happening, so we need to be thinking about that. This is a little still shot. I'm gonna flick through it quickly, because this is our very own Tash, who was at Pause Fest, which is a digital tech fest not long ago, and this was where she got her. Essentially, it's almost like a personality assessment through biometric reading, and there's so much of this stuff around. So this goes through, and if I don't click fast, you're going to see Tasha's total personality traits. And as I looked through it last night, I'm not entirely sure she's comfortable sharing this, even though she said she was. So I'm going to click. Oh, there you go. Okay. So the last theme I want to share that I think perhaps is obvious to many, but for me became really poignant in all the conversations we have. So I'm going to share this one before we actually just take a pause to have a quick conversation amongst you. Is speed. So this quote, in the new world, it's not the big fish that eats the small fish, it's the fast fish that eats the slow fish. So and we talked about this a lot, saying, in fact, sometimes the largeness of organisation is an encumbrance on our ability to deliver on our customer, and you'll see that that's some of the themes in the content we're going to share a little bit more as we go along. So, some of the things I saw, one of the key focusing questions for our tour group, if you like, or this sort of group of folk who I was travelling with, was what does digital mean for customer loyalty and brand? And one of the couple of really interesting insights were that, as I said before, consumers are quite willing to leave and go to challenger brands quite quickly. Size to them doesn't matter. It's not a representation of how good an organisation is necessarily anymore. And customers are really prepared to reevaluate, often on a daily basis, and often with massive communities through social networking of various forms, to be able to evaluate the price, the product, the service of particular services and offerings. So we've got this sort of massive transparency that's happening, that's really requiring organisations to be able to respond at speed to changes in the market. So this ability to move at speed, and some really interesting things they talked about are saying that there are no leaders who've ever operated in a market that's going this fast, or that will ever be this slow. So they're saying that the world of work is continuing to increase at pace, and as leaders, we're not used to working at the pace that we need to, or we need to based on current markets. So it's a really interesting implication for the capabilities we need as organisations and as leaders. So that's the 5 themes that really struck me, and we're going to move into content after a little bit of a reflection. But what I thought we could do now is perhaps just take a couple of minutes. I know you've sort of introduced yourself to some of the people, but have a couple of minutes to have a chat about which of those themes are most relevant to your organisation. So based on what you're seeing, and I did have some slides in here, I took them out. I know that different parts of the market and the different sectors that you represent are experiencing this at different paces. It's absolutely true. There are some, retail, media, they're right at the front edge of this work, and then there are others, that are manufacturing that are feeling this, but not at the same pace. So have a bit of a conversation about, which of these you're feeling a little bit more. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back to the next part. Okay. So I sort of got around. There are lots of conversations there. I'm not going to debrief that, but Chris and I are going to spend another 20 or so minutes talking about some of the implications of that, and then we're going to give you another chance to have a chat to those around you. So we've got probably 2 big takeouts, and Chris and I are now going to sort of do our very best to integrate, if you like, the practice of Silicon Valley and the science of PsyOps. So we're going to sort of flip between both of us. But our 2 big takeouts. The first one, the first big so what number 1, if you like, is that all of those themes I've just talked about absolutely feel important and big in terms of their implications. But the big takeout for me was that leadership and culture are at the heart of enabling all of these attributes. As I shared, going to this, what I potentially thought might be a bit of a tech fest, and I did get warned. So a CEO said to me, "How this might be a bit too heavy for you tech wise," and so I was like, "Okay," and I went along, and they had to they were trying to pull people up. They just couldn't stop talking about culture and leadership and the importance. And I don't mean necessarily the organisations I talked about, but even the participants. They were so fascinated by the implications of this. Without running through all of them, I know many of you will see the implications of these themes for people, but I sort of listed a couple. So, customer experience, fundamentally what we're talking about is trying to build human organisations that can respond to human problems. We're not talking about organisations that are efficient or even just that drive customer satisfaction, but we're talking about human experience. So both in the design and delivery of that, it's fundamentally a leadership and culture opportunity and challenge. Hyper-specialisation, I talked about the implication that has for hyper-connectivity, how we connect with other organisations in our ecosystem and how we connect with each other in organisations, and we're not sort of siloed, we're connected at speed. Self-disruption. It doesn't talk about how we disrupt, but it talks about how we repurpose and retool an organisation, and how in changing, flipping an organisation on its head, you can remain focused on purpose and keep people aligned on that. It's fundamentally a leadership and culture problem. AI and big data, I talked to the fact that it's big and it's happening, and there is a lot of data, but knowing the questions to ask the data and knowing the problems or the challenges or the opportunities that are possible is really the big challenge there, and that's fundamentally a problem solving, and again taps into that customer experience work, and speed. Really talks about organisations that can have super change ability, the ability to change at pace and at speed and do it well. So they're fundamentally leadership and culture opportunities that come out of this. So that was the big so what number one for me. The so what number two is what we're going to now spend some time on and share some practical examples and some science, was that of those organisations that I visited, they've cracked the culture code. And by that, I don't mean necessarily that they've got the very best and wonderful and loving cultures to work in. You can read and Google anything that you want around Google, around Amazon, and you can find some stories. But they are doing some things particularly well that's supporting performance. We want to talk about that a little bit. So up here, I've sort of described that, or on the slide I've described that. That is that I've found their ability to talk to the mindsets that they're looking from their employees, or they're seeking from their employees, and sometimes we use the term mental model, so how they think, the mindset required for success, the way that links to the organisational practices, the critical practices that connect behaviour with business outcomes. They're defining those particularly well, and the outcomes that they're intending from that mindset and practice when put together are particularly clear. They talk about the connections between what we want you to think, how we want you to practice, and what the outcomes of those practices need to be, quite eloquently. Sometimes we talk a lot about culture, we talk about how values, or we talk about behaviour in isolation. They're talking about it in connection to key practices that connect to key business outcomes or performance outcomes. So it's a very connected conversation, and I've got a couple of examples. I'm sure there are examples in these organisations where that doesn't always come to play, but there are some critical ones that are being replicated in many other organisations because of their success in these organisations. The first one is at Amazon, the concept of a press release. Who knows about this one? Yep, yeah, so just one. So this is really fascinating. So I spent some time with Amazon, but I have also spent a little bit more time with them in one of their sort of deep masterclasses around this concept. So their press release is essentially a practice that they have. If you come up with a great idea, and Amazon is all about coming up with new ideas and going to market quickly. If you've got a new idea, the way that you get a business case up and running and the way that you get funding for that business case is that you need to write a press release. And your press release needs to describe, if you come up with this idea today and it took you 2 years to build it, it needs to describe in 2 years how you would be describing that product or solution to the market, how much it cost, what the qualities would be, what problems it's solving. You would have a bunch of FAQs, that you would be asked by customers. So it's fundamentally asking you to do a business case and do funding based on customer needs. They talk about working back from the customer. So it makes sense. They're not the first organisation to think like that. Apple have been known for doing this particularly well, but they're really embedding that in their key end-to-end process around business case development and funding. What they're asking for employees when they go into that, so you build this press release, and then you have to hand it around to all of your peers and colleagues, and then outside of that press release workshop, if you like, you have to hand it around to get really deep, specific, detailed, and thorough critique. So you have to be critiqued on this, because essentially these people are consumers and customers who will have different perspectives. And so you can see the mindset that they're asking. They talk they talk a lot to the concept of psychological safety. The ability to be able to share views and the ability to be able to create an environment where people can share views quickly. They talk about valuing critique or feedback and seeing it as a source of data rather than seeing it as a form of criticism. They talk about flexible thinking, the ability to be able to change your mind, So data is everything. If we've got good data and we interrogate an idea well, changing your mind is fine. That's actually seen as a positive attribute. The outcomes here are that it's clearly, squarely focused on customer and squarely focused on delivering value. So they've embedded that within their organisation, and they've got they talk about it quite articulately around the fact that these mindsets are linked to this practice, and that practice is linked to these particular outcomes. Just a really quick share, just because it's sort of cool and sort of practical. This was these are essentially if you want to call them mindsets, but the behaviours that come out through Amazon's leadership principles. I really liked them because they were quite non-theoretical. They weren't detailed. They used sort of plain language. Some of them are a bit hard to see, and also they were asking everyone to be a leader. So it wasn't a role-based thing. It was about everyone being able to display the capabilities of a leader. So it felt very accessible from a role level and from a language level. And I circled a couple. That one, they were talking about leaders being right a lot, and what they mean by that is that really good leaders tend to be smart and they do some good stuff, but they will change their mind, so they're right more often than not because they continue to flex with what's needed and use data to inform that decision making. They certainly talk about hiring and developing the best a lot as well. So I might sort of flip over to Chris now to share some of your reflections from a science perspective.
Absolutely. So leadership and management was a pretty big theme at SciOp as well. So I thought I'd just quickly share a little bit of research, which I thought connected quite nicely to that previous point of Dylan's, that everyone is a leader on a mission. So this is really cutting edge research. I'm a little bit excited to present it. The book from which it's connected to is not going to come out till later in the year, so we're feeling pretty cool about being able to stand up here and talk about it today. But essentially it's a big research study conducted by Gartner. So 7,300 employees, 300 HR execs, and they had the ambition to try and work out what are the key factors or what's the key management style that leads to employee development. So they went through this big journey and came up with 4 particular styles of management. So there's the teacher style, who sort of develop and coach based on their own experience. There's the always-on management style, which self-explanatory, really frequent coaching and development. There's the connector, who give really targeted coaching and feedback, but however, they're more than willing to connect their employees to someone else with better expertise if the situation emerges. And lastly, the cheerleader. So these people take far more of a hands-off approach, lots of positive feedback, but really see it as the role of the employee to self-direct their own development. So maybe pause for a second and think about which one of those speak to you the most as the most effective. And Dylan, I might get you to do a quick click for the reveal. So it turns out the connector management style is the far superior style for developing employees. It's connected with 3 times more likely to generate high-performing staff, and also some really strong links to higher employee engagement. So that sort of always on, that sort of high contact management approach actually turned out to be quite detrimental to performance. So it turns out it's more of a case of quality over quantity. And just linking back to Dylan's point before about hyper-specialisation and hyper-connectivity, this just kind of reinforces that point a little bit stronger, that those who are able to use their network and connect others are able to generate far better outcomes. So I found that interesting, Dylan.
Thank you, Chris. So we're going to keep moving. We've got another couple of examples of practices that play out this connection between cracking the culture code. So, example 2 came from Google, and it's their what they call their Area 120 incubator. So many of you will be aware of this sort of concept at Google, that you can spend 20% of your time on passion projects that are typically to do with innovation and things like that. And people then said, well, that's great. We work 100 hours at Google, so that extra 20 hours can become our 120 hours. So that's where they come up with this new concept of this Area 120 incubator, which is a cheeky play on words for them, which is to say, okay, let's find great ideas and let's let people dedicate their whole role to that. So I'm going to describe what this Area 120 is and how it also connects into this mindset practice outcome narrative. So the Area 120 is, they call it a democratized incubator, so anyone can apply for this, and essentially you come up with an idea, and again, Google, same as Amazon, they're all about coming up with ideas, being able to commercialize and scale them. You have to come up with a business case. The business case needs to include how you're going to leverage Google capabilities and skills and products, so it's about the collective. If you get through, and the business case criteria, I've put them down in the outcomes there because really they're the key things that they're looking for. Is it focused on customer and can it be scaled? So will it benefit customers and will it benefit Google? They're very clear about talking about it needing to do both. And does it solve everyday customer problems, customer necessities they talk about, not niceties. So they're very anchored in the criteria for getting through this. If you get through the business case, you get 6 months funding to spend your whole time on that and to scale up and get a team from the rest of Google. So this is this concept of pulling people in with requisite capabilities to support it. And then you've got 6 months to disprove that idea. So they talk really, really clearly about the fact that we know our cognitive biases are to find an idea and then find facts to help prosecute that idea. And they're saying we need to fail fast and we need to be able to poke holes in that idea to see if it really is market ready, and if it's not, we need to fail fast and move on to the next thing, which brings in those sort of mindsets. You know, the first one was, let's bring in the Google collective. They talk about psychological safety. I'm going to hand to Chris in a moment because they were one of the organisations that really did some empirical research to think about this concept of psychological safety. Fast, fail, and customer wins and customer value beats your idea. It's not about your idea, it's about the value that your idea can bring to customers. So Chris, do you want to share a little bit about your insights?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Dylan mentioned, one of the key tenets behind Google's Area 120 is this idea of psychological safety. It's a really highly valued attribute at Google because they've gone through their own sort of research process, which has highlighted the significance of it. So just to describe that a little bit, some of you might have heard of Google's Project Aristotle before, not sure, perhaps, maybe. But essentially they went through a journey, they did a big investigation around 50 years of research into what creates a high-performing team. They also investigated 180 teams of their own internally, and they uncovered a couple of really interesting things. So first of all, aspects like personality, skills, background, those sorts of things didn't actually matter. It didn't really influence high performance. What did matter were group norms, or essentially those unwritten rules which govern the way that we interact with each other within a team. So more specifically, high-performing teams had team members who more or less spoke for proportionately the same amount of time, and team members who possessed a high level of social sensitivity, which is essentially the ability to pick up on how others in the group are feeling. So when combined, those two factors create psychological safety. And when we think about aspects like Google's Area 120 and the other innovative high-performance practices that are engaging in, psych safety is the key ingredient that enables those.
Yeah. Terrific. Okay, so last example we're going to share before we're going to give you a time just to connect and have a chat about some of those things and the relevance of them to you and your organisations. So this one it's got a terrible name, but it's a really, really interesting case study that came from Salesforce. So it's called V2 Mum. It's not terrible. It's just a bit weird. So it's probably not the most innovative practice, but it's amazing through the disciplined application of it. So V2 Mum stands for vision, values, methods, obstacles, and measures. And you can see it's written up on an envelope because they said that's where the CEO came up with this in a cafe, that their organisation needed to be built on a V2 Mum concept. The practice is essentially this, that as an organisation, and most of the organisations in here in some form will do this, that we needed to describe our vision, values, methods, obstacles, and measures, and that would be their annual sort of strategy on a page, if you like. What was fascinating about it was that it was an open source piece of work, so everyone was involved in this. So the entire organisation has the opportunity to either be in the room or to be connected virtually to watch this get defined. And they spent up to 2 days as an organisation with people posting comments on, well, why is that word? And is that really our obstacle, or is that really an opportunity, for example? So they said it's actually a really heavy time investment in getting people aligned on their organisational V2 mum. What happens from then is that V2 mum needs to be rolled down to every employee, and you can see there on the smartphone, the person's V2 mum. So everyone has to have their own strategy on a page. Again, not earth-shattering. That would be something that many organisations would have. What was really fascinating is they said it would be very regular to go into a meeting and to sit across from someone, and before you start to go, show me what's on your V2 mum. They're transparent to everyone in any case, so they're publicly accessible within the Salesforce environment, so that I know what you're trying to achieve, and so that I can work out how I can help you. And they talk about this being a narrow document, and they use this concept of how do you get more wood behind less arrows. So how do you, as an organisation, really focus on the things that matter and get them done? So less arrows, more wood behind the ones that count. What they're really trying to go at here as an organisation who needs to have speed and needs to be focused on customers, they're very conscious of the ability to disconnect as an organisation into functional silos that don't support speed and customer. So this document and this disciplined application of this process is something that supports transparency, immediate transparency. It supports the collective. How do we not fragment as an organisation? But it also supports accountability and focus. So they talk about those mindsets and behaviours very clearly at Salesforce, and they say one of the key practices that we're disciplined in going about is this V2 mum. So, and that little quote down there, if it's not on the V2 mum, it won't get done. It was a very live and disciplined process about hyper alignment, if you like. So, Chris, I'm just going to hand across to you to share a little bit of the science on that one.
Yeah, that's right. So I want to share a little bit more science behind why the V2 mum was such a successful concept. So this particular research piece was conducted by Gallup, and it's around understanding what are the needs of the emerging workforce. By the emerging workforce, I mean millennials, so the entitled generation or the empowered generation, depending on which side of the fence you sit on.
Looking at?
No one in particular. And so what they found is that 4 out of 5 college grads rated it either very important or extremely important to have purpose in their work. However, only 40% had found a meaningful career, only 34% indicated that they were deeply interested in their work, and only 26% reported that they actually liked what they were doing on a daily basis. So that's referred to as the purpose gap, and its implications are actually quite vast. Now, it means that millennials are after purpose over a paycheck, they're after development over satisfaction, a coach over a boss, integration over separation, so those sorts of things. So what does that actually mean for organisations? It means we need to be better at articulating and connecting our people to their purpose. So the reason why the V2 mum is so successful is because it keeps it front of mind for employees. They're continuously referring back to their purpose and they're sharing it. There's a lot of transparency. So in other words, Dylan, what they're doing is they're minding the purpose gap.
Minding the purpose gap.
I stole that from him.
Yeah, yeah, terrific. So I think that we tried to focus today on 3 key practices, and we really want to give you now some time to connect. We know from what you've told us in the past that an important part of today is just being able to connect. So I've got a couple of reflection questions for you here, but we're comfortable you taking this in any direction that you would like. The first one is just, are there any similar practices to the ones we've just described that are present in your organisation, and are they effective? So have you got any similar things happening? And the next one is perhaps a step further, is are there any similar mindset, practice, outcome patterns that exist in your organisation, or perhaps that should, as a way of anchoring that culture code, if you like. So we're just going to hand it to you to have a chat with those around you and share some of your experiences for the next 10 or so minutes. So yeah, thanks folks. Have a talk amongst yourselves.